All right, thanks for joining us. I'm John Baumer, Director of Government Relations with the Arizona Society of CPAs. With us today is Representative Ben Toma, Chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, and Ryan DeMenna of DeMenna Public Affairs. Thank you both for joining me.
Thanks for having us.
Mr. Toma, this session has certainly been an abnormal one, definitely one for the books. Do you have any thoughts you'd like to share with us on this session?
Where to begin? You're right, it's been a very abnormal session. You know, I'll remind everybody what seemed like forever ago, but back in January and February, we were working very hard in order to get the budget done by crossover week. And, you know, I was involved with that because I'm part of appropriations, and we were getting very close to getting a workable budget done. While that didn't work out, in some ways, it sort of did work out because, as we all know, the unexpected happened. And with although a lot of work was done, we had to hit the pause button on it, and I think it was a good thing in the end. Instead, what we've chosen to do, as you all know, is pass kind of the baseline budget, which was last year's budget. Some have called it the skinny budget, which I'm not sure is entirely fair, because it was a pretty robust budget from last year, and so now we have that as a placeholder, if you will, to finish out this year. And you know, and then the session just sort of ended. So there were some loose ends that definitely need to be addressed at some point in the future. It might be next session, it might be in a special session. We'll see kind of what's in the tea leaves and what's in the cards. But for now, I'm pleased to say at least that we've got a robust budget, which was a repeat, of course, of the year before. And we did get some of the bills done, although I'll fully admit there are some things left on the table.
Right, absolutely. You mentioned special sessions. Do you anticipate, if the legislature is called into a special session, that the state would conform to the CARES Act when it comes to forgiven PPP loan taxability?
That's a great question. You know, the PPP and the loan forgiveness in particular, I don't foresee that being a problem in any significant way. However, there are other components of the CARES Act that could have a very significant financial impact on the state's budget. Part of the reason that you're not seeing a rush, and this is of course just my opinion at this point, sure, but part of the reason you're not seeing a rush to a special session and do a budget is because there's still so much unknown. I would say if anything is to categorize kind of what's been happening over the last couple of months, I would say it's just uncertainty, right? Just overall, both on the socioeconomic level and pretty much every other level. It's just a lot of uncertainty. And so I do think there's an argument to be made, and probably some wisdom in not rushing back into another budget discussion until we have a much better idea of what the actual impact will be to our actual, you know, revenues and whatnot. So in terms of conforming, you know, to the PPP, absolutely. The debt forgiveness piece, I think, is something that we should conform to. But there is an open discussion. I have to sort of level with you. There is an open discussion about some of the other components of it that we're really going to have to figure out what the impact is to the state revenue. So I can't, you know, speculate at this point exactly where that's going to land. I will tell you that my personal preference on this would be to ensure that whatever we do, that we are helpful to businesses, and particularly to small businesses and individuals, of course, because, you know, especially when you're talking about a small business, a lot of times there's very little distinction between an LLC, a partnership of some kind, or just an individual filer. So I do want to make sure that we're helpful, and to the extent that we can provide any sort of additional clarity, additional perhaps remove barriers, remove complexity. Those are the sorts of things that I would be very interested in pursuing.
And if I could, you know, Mr. Toma, I think you made a great point that sort of the order of the day presently is uncertainty. And that's frankly the exact opposite of what you look for when you're heading into a special session. You want to know exactly what it is you're walking into, that you've got the votes lined up. And to your point, I think, you know, the CARES Act loan forgiveness period was recently extended. So there are even changes being made to the CARES Act that was just recently passed. So there's just so many moving parts that I think you've got exactly the right approach. Let's make sure we know what's happening before we get in the mix.
I mean, absolutely. When you're talking about what's happening at the national level, one of the biggest frustrations that I'm hearing from businesses just in my private life, right, in my private business, as well as just other business owners that I'm talking to, is this frustration with the constantly moving target and the changing guidance that's been happening quite a bit. And also what appears to be interpretations by the agencies in DC that were not part of the original law. That's adding quite a bit of frustration. So again, I think if we can help in some way, absolutely, let's do that. But I definitely don't want to be in a position where we add further uncertainty by passing something and then they change something in DC, then we have to come back and fix it again. And so I would say, being judicious about this and not rushing into it would be the wise way to proceed.
Yeah, agreed.
Absolutely, yeah. Ed, touching on that as well in terms of all the uncertainty, I know a lot of firms and members of ours are concerned with potential liability when it comes to COVID-19 and opening their business, especially since financial and accounting services were considered essential services under the stay-at-home order. Again, if the legislature goes back into a special session, what do you expect to see in terms of a COVID-19 liability legislation?
That's a great question, and I fully agree that liability protection is very, very important. And you would see something similar to what the House passed before we went to sine die and into session. Of course, that bill had a number of other things in there, but I think something around gross negligence or something like that would make a lot of sense. I'm not sure what the final details are. I know that Senator Leach has been working on a plan that we've been part of, and we're looking at that as well to make sure that it fits all the criteria that we need it to. But I would say for businesses, and even for other groups, schools, for example, that's kind of a big deal here. Some of the districts are concerned about opening up, and obviously that's disruptive to businesses as well, because from a familial standpoint, right? If you've got no childcare, or if you have childcare issues, then it becomes a labor issue. And again, that same thing, uncertainty. We really got to come back and provide some certainty. So liability protection has to be at the top of the list when we come back.
Absolutely. You mentioned the baseline budget that the legislature passed this year. Do you anticipate the legislature addressing the budget any further in a special session beyond what was passed in March, or do you think this is probably it for 2020?
That's a difficult question. Just because we keep talking about uncertainty, I feel like we're broken record, at least to some extent. But to answer it, I do think that that is a very strong possibility that we will address something in some sort of a special session. I will say there are a number of things to think about related to the budget. Specifically, there's a lot of federal money that needs to be potentially allocated, in which case my personal preference, I will tell you, and I will speak for some of the members of my caucus for sure, if not all, is to use the federal money as much as possible, and also to significantly look at what we have in the rainy day fund, the budget stabilization fund. And the reason for that is, we've done a great job of really bringing that to $1 billion plus. And so we have the funds available at this point in order to mitigate any short-term disruption. And I think and hope, and all indicators seem to be pointing this way, short of what might happen when the PPP terms run out at the end of this month. So a little caveat there, but our hope is that this is going to be a very fast V-shaped recovery, and that's what I'm seeing so far, instead of kind of a long, recession or great recession type of U recovery that we've had over the last few years. So, if we have a very sharp V recovery, then we would like to see the rainy day funds being used to backfill any short-term disruption, and potentially some of the federal money, and otherwise have very little disruption to the rest of our budget. At least that's the hope at this point.
And Mr. Toma, it seemed there's kind of a third track as well, where, and this is very preliminary, but some of these initial revenue estimates appear to be just a little better than initially anticipated. So I'm hopeful that trend continues, and the economic damage isn't as bad as they initially thought.
Absolutely, we all are, and that's what I was referencing before. I think initially we thought it was going to be considerably worse than it appears to be now. There is that little asterisk. We're not quite sure what happens when the PPP terms run out. As I understand it, for most businesses, that will basically be at the end of June.
Yeah.
So we might see an increase in layoffs. But then we're hoping that's not the case.
Right.
But it is what it is. We'll watch it. However, every indicator is better than expected at this point.
Yes.
Which is very good news, actually.
Yeah.
In spite of sort of the tone of the media and whatnot out there, we're seeing good news. We really are.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and tying on to that again, if any special session were to be called as it relates to the budget, do you see any substantial tax reform packages being considered either this year or potentially next year as a result?
Well, I've had the pleasure in my short term in the legislature of being involved in some of the most complicated tax reforms and some of the most sort of biggest heavy lifts, if you will. I guess feel free to disagree, but it's been interesting. It's been educational, and I will say that as long as I'm part of this, and as long as I'm part of Ways and Means in particular, I will continue to push for tax reform wherever it makes sense. And again, sort of the same ideas of simplification, making it easy for people to comply, making it easy for businesses, and reducing the burden as much as possible. And that's always been kind of my goal. Obviously, if we can get in tax cuts, then I would love to see that happen as well, because it's good for business, and business owners do what I do and what most of my friends do, which is reinvest. And that ends up being good for everybody. And it really is I know overused example, but it's the rising tide lifts all boats. And that's exactly what happens when it comes to this. To answer your question specifically, some of the things we're looking at, we're considering some tax-related incentives, if you will. For example, one of the ideas that we've been hashing out is the idea of an amnesty of sorts, both for perhaps TPT and also on the income tax side. So maybe having that as part of it, the idea is it will result potentially in a little bit more revenue for the state, but more importantly, I think it just gives the people the opportunity to come clean and to come up to date. And the amnesty, of course, will be for fees and interest, not necessarily for the principal balance, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
But those are the types of things we're talking about. So that could very well be part of a special session or some sort of COVID-related bill that's financial in nature. In addition to that, especially when we have revenues available, which I expect hopefully to see based on this current trajectory as soon as the very next year, then I remain committed to additional reforms and additional tax cuts.
Thank you. Well, good to hear that, and appreciate you taking the time to speak with us, and Ryan, you as well. So Representative Toma, do you have any closing thoughts you'd like to share with the Society of CPAs?
Oh, thank you. You guys are great. You'll be pleased to know that I do not do my own taxes. I have very good CPAs that do it, professionals, and I'm pleased to know that. As a matter of fact, I was just finishing them up this morning before the call for this year. So fun stuff. I don't want to do what you do, but I do respect you, and I definitely appreciate the assistance. So keep up the good work, and if I can be helpful, you've got good representation, and the DeMennas can get a hold of me, but obviously you can get a hold of me directly. Always open to good ideas when it comes to tax reform. So keep them coming.
Absolutely, and of course, the Society is a resource for you as well, should you need us at any point.
Appreciate it.
All right. Thank you, Representative Toma. Thank you, Ryan. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you, Mr. Toma.
Thanks, guys.